What is it that people are seeing? Is it a man? An animal? A myth? Or something else? Are they delusional? Are they lying? Some are pastors. Some are law enforcement. Some are military. If they are delusional liars, why do we trust them to lead us to God? To put people in jail? And to protect our way of life? Why are their words and actions good enough for that? But when it comes to experiencing something out of the ordinary, something fascinating, something possibly terrifying, they become a fool, a joke, an idiot. Not here. We are the BigDogT2B. Welcome to the show. Hello everyone, my name is Jack, and welcome to the BigDogT2B. Tonight's show is going to be quite a bit different. It started with a grand dream in 2019. Nate and I were talking about a survey and a website where we could host scripted podcasts/podcasters. We reached out to several people with the idea. 3 people with what I considered to be the right mindset were open to participating in the plan. Me, Nate, and Chuck Slabs from OK Chasing the Beast. I'm by no means a stranger to speaking to or in front of an audience, but I had no desire to go on or be part of a podcast. So over time, Chuck and Nate eventually talked me into appearing on one of Chuck's shows. In the background, you can hear my dogs pant and cars drive by while I walk around the property in Maryland, talking on my Bluetooth. Chuck posted the show on his channel June 18th, 2019. Things got rough in 2020, and Chuck pulled his channel. Chuck recently contacted me, stating that he had had computer issues and lost all his shows. He asked if I still had a copy of those files on my computer. The answer, unfortunately, was no, but they were available on our website. Unfortunately, the website does not allow a download of information uploaded to the website. So what you are about to hear is a 3rd generation copy, or a recording of a recording of a recording. So this is my first appearance on a podcast, where I speak about nonverbal communication. So without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to another episode of Chasing the Beast. I'm your host, Chuck, and tonight I've got a really good guest for the show. His name is Jack. We're really good friends. We've talked to each other quite a bit. So without further ado, I want to welcome Jack to the show. Jack, how you doing this evening?
Not bad, brother. How are you doing?
Doing good. Doing real good. Well, Jack, right off the bat, I'd like to see, there's several things that we're going to talk about tonight. So right off the bat, I'd like to ask you, what got you interested in the whole Bigfoot phenomenon?
Well, I guess you wouldn't say that I initially got interested in the whole Bigfoot phenomenon. I grew up hunting the Mobile River Swamp, And if you're not from around there, most people don't know anything about it really, but it's about 400 or 500 square miles of inhospitable territory, let's say. It's flooded timber, alligators, water moccasins, rattlesnakes, bugs. It's not the most hospitable place to go, and especially the summertime months. But I grew up hunting and fishing that. And back right after, somewhere around, when Big moved not far from me and the dogs. And the dogs decided it was time to leave and go back up the top of the hill, and I followed right behind them. So get up there, light a fire, and, night comes, and my brother falls asleep. Another thing about my brother, if he were alive today, he'd be diagnosed with some type of sleep disorder. The joke in the family about him was that if he fell asleep and the house caught on fire, that he was going to die. And, not very many are in a good mood when you wake them up, and when you're not a nice guy to start out with, that just gets worse. So sometimes I can't remember really if I'd gone to sleep or not, or if I was, still awake, but I know the fire was burning kind of low, and something came in close to that hill, seemed kind of big, and dogs took out after it and started running it. And I don't know if you or your listeners have ever used dogs to hunt with. Certain animals run certain ways. A rabbit will run in a big circle. It's pretty predictable. The dogs, they jump a rabbit, and you go to them, and you find where the dogs came through before, and you stand there and you stand real still. 10, 15, 20 minutes later, the rabbit's going to come back through, and you take it. And back in that part of the country, we had two types of rabbits, really. They both would get together and make little rabbits. It's not like they were different species or anything. But we had what we called hillbillies, which were lighter colored, smaller framed rabbits that were up in the briar patches and thickets in the hill country. And we had what we call cane cutters, which were much darker, much heavier, much meatier rabbits. They were good eating rabbits. And that's what we were in there hunting. One of the dogs in this pack his name was Mike, and he was a long-legged, hard-eyebrowed fox-type beagle. And he wasn't very nice either. And he was a trail dog. And by trail dog, I meant that he ran slow. He ran so slow that if the rabbit were to stop and turn around and go in almost the opposite direction, Mike ran so slow that when the other dogs would run and lose the scent, Mike could keep the scent. And he would start trailing the rabbit and call the other dogs back to him. So these dogs light out, and this thing, deer will run. They'll find a break. They'll find a creek, or they'll find a ridge. They'll find a piece of flat land where it's relatively open that borders a thicket, and they'll run down that generally just as hard and as fast as they can, and gain some distance. And then they'll jump across a creek, or water, or ridge, or into a thicket, and that's the way they try and lose the dogs. I haven't run very many foxes, but the foxes that I have run, they tend to run straight as a nail. When you look at old pictures of fox hunters, you got a pack of dogs, and you got a bunch of guys on horses, and that's because they run. That's because they run straight and fast. And whatever this was, ran straight and fast, and this was through a swamp, which is another thing that's just kind of weird, because these dogs ran straight and fast and clean, just about out of hearing. And doing that through the swamp in that flooded timber, that's hard to do, especially in the middle of the night. Well, they started coming back, and dogs have certain noises that they make when they're trailing. They have certain noises that they make when they're running. And it's easy to tell the difference when they're trailing. They tend to yip just a little bit, and when they're running, they tend to squall. And but these weren't coon dogs. They weren't a walker. They weren't a black and tan. They weren't anything like that. Some long-legged dog. But they started coming back, running whatever way they were running, came back, and it stopped a couple hundred yards away from this hill. And the barks went from squalling, chasing, to aggressive, and it stopped. And these weren't coon dogs. These weren't dogs that were trained to tree. And besides that, they weren't barking like they were treeing. They were barking like they were angry. And after a couple of minutes of that, one of them let out a cry, and it was kind of a cry squad, kind of a, and the dog shut down. The rest of them went silent. And, you get that far back in that kind of country, and, not everybody's legal. No one's legal all the time. And what we do is, small game season back there running rabbits, that's three rounds in a shotgun field load shot. I have to put a plug in your gun. Well, what we do is we put 2 rounds of buckshot, or a buckshot and a slug for the first 2 rounds, put 2 field loads in, chamber around, put another field load in there. So you had 3 field loads that you could rack out if something went bad, and you needed something with a little bit harder punch to it. Well, when that dog squalled, I racked those 3 field loads out of there, and I loaded up with 5 rounds of buckshot and slugs, and 3-inch Magnum 12 gauge, and it was an old Wingmaster 870. And the dogs come back. I can hear them coming back, and I don't know if, if there's something with them, but they come back, and when I see them, when they hit the edge of the firelight, because I built fire up, first thing I thought was skunk. They had their heads down and tails down, and they were humble, and I was like, oh, man, this is going to be bad. They're just going to stink. But they stink. They stunk like swamp mud. They stink like skunk. And they wouldn't get away from me. As far as they would get away from me is as far as I could push them with my foot. Take hounds like that. You reach out, put your foot on their shoulder, and redirect them, keep them away from you, especially when they're all nasty and wet and muddy like that. But whatever this thing was that they were on, I guess you can say that's when the show started, because this thing would howl, scream, and it would start out in a noise that was really, really, really low pitch. It was you could feel it more than you could hear it, and it would move from that low, loud noise all the way through basically what was a high-pitched whistle. And you spend time back there in those swamps, and you've got loons and egrets and heron and osprey and bobcats and just any manner, screech owls, any manner of animal out there, just making some god-awful noises. It's absolutely amazing the noises that foxes make. But this was nowhere near any of that. It was way too low. It was way too high. It was way too loud, and it was way too long. So over the course of that night, I burned everything on that hill that I could burn, including the 5-gallon bucket. And my only real job in that whole thing of things was the only time that my brother would tolerate you waking him up, was if you were waking him up to go hunting. And that morning I didn't. Sun came up, and he woke up on his own, and he was grumpy, and I did something pretty out of character for me, especially concerning my brother. I cussed him, and I made it clear that if he didn't get in that boat, I was leaving him. And that turned on the not nice guy father. But I was standing there with a loaded gun, and it was clear that I was getting in the boat and I was leaving. And that I didn't know exactly where we were, so I didn't know exactly how to get back to him, and I suggested that he needed to get in the boat with us. And he managed to talk me into the fact of my imagination had run away with me, and that I needed to calm down, and this isn't who we are. This isn't the way that we behave. So I guess you say I picked myself up by the bootstraps, and the one thing they couldn't argue with was Mike was gone. He didn't come back. He asked me, he said, well, which way were they when they shut down? And I told him about how far. And I grew up hunting, and I grew up in a German family, and the men are hard, and I started hunting when I got my behind torn up. If they had to carry me out, they had to pick me up and carry me. I didn't get to go back the next time. So by this time, when we go hunting, we go in different directions. I was, like I say, around 15, 16 years old. And we keep track of each other by, brush noise, sticks popping, gunshots, cutting off the dogs. Not this day. He didn't get outside. And are you familiar with what I mean by an oak hammock?
No.
In the woods? Well, an oak hammock, for what we called an oak hammock, was a stand of mature oaks, and the canopy basically has killed off all the vegetation underneath it. And, all the smaller trees that died out, There's a bunch of leaves on the ground and keep much of the undergrowth from getting up very tall. And we stepped into this oak hammock and we found that dog, and whatever had gotten a hold of him, it beat him against a tree. And the blood started somewhere around shoulder height, blood and hair and everything, meat and everything. It was stuck in the bark of that tree. Started about shoulder height and probably went down somewhere a little above waist high, between the waist and the ribs. And he wasn't a small dog. Like I said, he was a big, square-headed, long-legged, adult male beagle. So he was probably a good, 30 pounds maybe. Whatever beat him against that tree, he turned around and threw it about probably 30, 40 feet, and when it hit the ground, he probably slid another 10. But the odd thing was there were no claw marks, there were no puncture wounds, there was no teeth. We went over and we looked at the dog, and back then, all you had was a leather collar and a brass tag with your name and telephone number to identify your dog in case when you turn the dogs out, when the dogs don't come back, somebody else find him, they'll call you. My brother reached down, he pulled the collar off that dog, and he turned around and looked at me and said, "Don't you tell nobody about this." And I didn't. I joined right after I turned 21. It's probably another 5 years or so after I joined that I told somebody about that.
Why do you think your brother didn't want you to tell anybody about it?
Well, he said it then. He said it, on the ride home a couple of times. And, when you look at that part of the country, and there are three terms used down there to describe things that, let's say, aren't exactly everyday things, the way that I remember it. And, you take old folks, old men, when they talk about that stuff, they normally talked about it under their breath, kind of a hushed tone, like, I don't want nobody to hear me.
Mm-hmm.
And those three things were boogers, haints, and catamounts. And just even back then, people that didn't live in the swamps, or they didn't live in the mountains, or they didn't live in the hills, or they didn't live in the backwaters, somebody from back there say something like that, the people that we would, by normal everyday standards, term as educated, would think that you're crazy. Plus, my dad would have taken kindly to my older brother having me someplace where I was put in danger. Not being an adult yet. Probably would have thought twice about me going back with him. And as not nice a guy as he was, I was his hunting buddy. I was his fishing buddy. That's I guess that's what you could say kind of got me interested in it, but it didn't get me interested in it for a lot of years, really, I guess. But I'm not a believer. We've talked about that a lot.
Yes, we have.
I've seen a lot of things, heard a lot of things. I've killed and eaten most things in North America, short of bear, elk, and moose. Not that I haven't seen them. I've seen them. I've been around them. I've just never killed them and eaten them. Most other things I have, may have killed them, may not have eaten them. But I know what's in the woods. I know animal behaviors. I know animal communication. I know I've freaked a couple of my friends out because right time of year, right kind of weather conditions, I've tracked animals on scent and run over them and run them over other people. And I've experienced several things. Even to this day, I live in the middle of 61 acres. And you've been on the phone for a few of them.
Yes, I have.
That things that are just odd, things that you can't blame on a known 4-footed animal in North America.
Folks that are listening, I can vouch for Jack and his demeanor, and it amazes me. He's got activity around his place and on his land, but he's had some really crazy things and I've actually been on the phone with him when these things have happened to him. And for the life of me, I give him a hard time because I say, and you're not a believer. I don't understand how you're not a believer. So, Jack, you want to go into why you're not a believer?
Well, I'm not a rube. I'm not anybody's fool. I'm not easily fooled. I'm not prone to flights of fancy or conjecture. I work in hard, stark realities. And it's to the point to where, until I see one, which I've seen most, like I say, most other animals in North America, I've watched them relatively at length. I know their behaviors. I've watched them breathe. I've watched them blink. I've been, had bears get close enough to me and not know that I'm there. I've got close to bears enough that, they stopped, stood up, popped their teeth, groaned, huffed at me. So until it comes to a time when, and you get mad when I say this, but if Bigfoot Sasquatch exists, when I can watch it breathe and I can watch it blink and I can watch it move, or I smell its breath or pick a tick off of it or something like that, then I'll say, yeah, I believe. But until that day happens, I will say that I guess I don't believe, I suspect. But I can tell you a plethora of hard science that supports the possibility of the existence of such a thing.
Yeah, you folks out there, Jack is very, very intelligent, and I give him a lot of credit. He actually sent me his college term paper in English and let me read it, and it was all about the existence of Bigfoot and how people, with the evidence that he wrote, how could people even say they're not real? And for Jack not to be a believer, I said, man, you wrote a paper like this, and everything you put down on that paper is true. How can you not believe? But I kind of understand where he's coming from, and I give him a hard time about it, but I understand where he's coming from. So Jack, what about, what kind of things are you doing as far as, do you want to talk about the behavior, some of the behaviors maybe that people may run across, and not necessarily the behavior, but the communication aspect or non-communication aspect of what people may experience out in the woods if they run across them?
Well, we've talked a few times at length, and Nathan Bowling is a good friend of mine, and I've actually spent some time with Nate. We've done an outing, and I'm retired military. My portion of the military, even for my branch of the military, if you were to tell them if I was to go up and tell them what my job was, they would go, huh? And as a part of that, I have had some what general military people would call obscure training. I'm not a teams guy. I'm not a soft guy. I'm not a soft support guy. That's not what I did. But I have had and undergone and had some duties associated with some obscure trainings that are associated with nonverbal communication and humans. And I train dogs, and I have spent an extreme amount of time in the woods, and I've taken those things and I've applied them to my observation of animal behaviors, and I use them in my dog training. And the fact of the matter is that we communicate 24/7, even when we're asleep. All mammals, land mammals, in my opinion, share a common language, and that's eye contact, body posture, and vocal tones. And that message comes through stronger because, in my observations, in my opinion, it's written into our DNA. I worked as a bouncer on the side for most of my life, better than 30 years. And anybody that's worked the floor of the door can tell you that you can normally spot your problems when they walk through the door. And all of that's based in nonverbal communication. So if you look at vocal tones, and we'll take vocal tones and we'll take a simple statement and say, I love you. What did the message say? The message said, I love you, right?
Right.
Right. Did the message sound convincing?
No, not really.
No, not really. But if I was to say, I love you, that's a more convincing message.
Yes.
It's a softer tone. It's more submissive. It's more pleasant.
Mm-hmm.
So that changes the meaning of the message.
Right.
Right. That tone message, that vocal tone message, is in alignment with the verbal message, right? Which we stand apart from the rest of known mammals the way that we categorize them in that we have a vocabulary, a real vocabulary. Now, if I was to say, I love you, what does that message say? Does that message say I love you?
No, not at all.
No, not really. Because the tone message outweighed the verbal message. And by that, I say that the first primary communication, even for us, is a nonverbal communication. And when you talk about speech, it's about tone.
Mm-hmm.
And when you talk about tone, there are two basic tones. There are high-pitched tones, which are tones basically of play and pray. And there are low-pitched tones, which are tones of dominance and aggression. Have you ever been in a home where there's a dog in the home?
Oh, yeah.
The dog in the home, does the dog comply normally more to the commands of the wife or children, or to the husband in the house if there is one?
The husband.
The husband. Why? The reason why is because the husband's vocal tones, the primary message, the DNA ingrained message, is the vocal tone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because that's not the message of, hey, I'm playing, or I'm excited to see you, or that I'm something to eat. It's the message that says, hey, I'm big, I mean what I say, and that if you don't comply, I have the ability to become aggressive in a way that you may not be able to deal with.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. And animals communicate with each other that way. Animals whine when they're frustrated, when they're trapped, when they're cornered, when they're subdued, when they're rolled over and pinned. They whine. Whining animals tend to energize the dominant animal. Animals, when they want you to back off, do what? They make lower tone, louder tones, that thing, and that's that message, right? And that's that vocal tone message. Now, the separation between human beings, one of the things, or the primary thing that separates us in that communication, is when you go into an extension of body posture, right? How you hold yourself, right? It's not just standing, it's your complete posture, and for us, and even in animals, it goes into physical expressions. So the physical expression of every other mammal, land mammal on the planet, for it to do what we would call for us smiling, the primary purpose of that smile is to expose the teeth, primarily the canines, because for most mammals, land mammals, across the world, the mouth is a primary weapon, right?
Right.
And what they're doing is they are showing you their best, most offensive method of destruction, right? So for us to communicate in our method of smiling and showing our teeth, which is happy and relatively submissive, for us to do that to another animal, basically any other animal, land animal on the planet, that is actually an expression of dominance or aggression. Now you combine those things and you say, okay, well, we talked a little bit about vocal tones. And then you talk about posture. A relatively submissive posture, when you see people standing in a crowd or a group, they stand in a posture where they basically have both toes pointing towards you. And when both toes are pointing towards you, that is a relatively comfortable or submissive posture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is that from a physics and leverage kind of thing, imagine if you stood with your knees straight, with both toes pointed toward me. If I were to reach up and shove you hard in both shoulders, what would happen?
You'll fall down.
You'd fall down, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is a form of communication. For me to stand flat-footed with both toes pointed towards you is either a very submissive posture, or you could take it for humans into a basic dare, right? Here I am so much bigger than you are absolutely helpless, and I can stand in this relatively submissive posture, and there's basically not anything that you can do about it. So from that posture, just in the stance of an individual, when an individual feels threatened, right, they tend to take their weak foot and put their weak foot out in front of them.
Mm-hmm.
What this does is this allows them to absorb force from the front and allows them to prepare themselves forward. Someone who is feeling a flight complex will generally take their strong foot and put it behind them, again, to allow them to absorb force from the front, but also allow them to turn and retreat if the flight response becomes overwhelming. Leaning forward, leaning back.
Mm-hmm.
Those are messages, right? You take people that are in an argument. The person that feels like they're in the right and that they can win this, what do? They transfer their weight over their forward foot, and they lean forward, and they tend to wave their hands around. Where the other person will tend to shift their weight to their back foot, take their head further away from them to protect their head, and tend to put their hands up in front of them in case something's going to come to their face. Those are messages. Another thing about posture is how high your eyes are relative to the thing that you are communicating with, right? And that's a part of the whole mindset of the thing. And you'll see this with male children and how their response, particularly to their mother, changes as, one, their voice deepens, which says that I am now becoming stronger than you, and how the angle at which their eyes meet their mother's eyes changes, particularly if it gets to the point where their eyes are looking down at their mother, which puts their mother in a submissive stance. In the way that they respond to their mother, how much they listen to them, how much lip they give them, that whole thing. It's part of their DNA. It's not something that you can say and it's in every species on the planet. It's not just about humans. It's one of those opinion things, everybody's got them. In my opinion, everything other than the 7 deadly sins when it comes to humans is a learned behavior. Right? You can count on the 7 deadly sins. You see them in every other species on the planet all day, every day. So eye contact, body posture, vocal tones. We communicate. Now, any communication can be flat, just an exchange going back in between each other, or the communication can escalate. That communication can move into a point of an expression of force. So now we'll go down the road of expression of force, and we'll do it with a relatively regimented model of law enforcement. So the first expression of force is basically some type of sign, right? Something like posted, no trespassing, do not enter, government property, blah, 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 blah. Something that says, hey, there's a rule here and that somebody doesn't want you to do something. That's an expression of force. It's a nonverbal communication. Now from there, since we moved into more technology, it doesn't require the physical presence of a person to convey the message, right? So with technology, we have further extensions of that, which is recorded directions. You go into some sensitive areas around the country and military bases and some civilian facilities, and it will say, you'll have a motion sensor in this recording. Will go off and it'll say something like, stop and remain where you are. You have entered an unauthorized area. Deadly force is authorized. And then security forces start flooding the area, and they figure out that it's, some deer or something that set off the motion sensor. And they will do a clear, and then sound an all clear, and then go back to wherever they hang out till the alarm goes off again. But in that whole process, you have the next expression of force, which is physical presence. Mm-hmm. Right? That's the next expression of force is physical presence. And it's kind of like that whole thing. You've been acting up all day and all the other kind of stuff, and all of a sudden your dad just walks in the room and things just get kind of quiet. Why? Because his physical presence is an expression of force, right? I am the rule keeper. Physical presence is an expression of force. Law enforcement is an expression of force, right? You can have all of these things that say, hey, don't trespass. You can have these, these automated or, noises kinds of things, alarms that say, hey, don't do that. You've done something wrong. Quit. but there's a separation between that and when someone physically shows up with the intent of making sure that things go the way that they're supposed to go, and that's physical presence. Physical presence has a couple of different elevations, actually several different elevations in the middle of it. Your dad shows up. Well, if your dad was to walk in to another room of people and they don't know that he's a dad kind of person, they may not respond to him that way. Law enforcement wears a uniform. They wear a uniform for a reason. That's an expression of force. That's an extension of their physical presence. That physical presence says that I am a member of, and that there are others just like me, and that all of them within the sound of this radio will respond, so you need to comply with me. That's an expression of force.
Right.
Make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Now, law enforcement will go through that whole posture thing of expression of force. They tend to start off by talking to you, unless things are going bad right off the rip. They'll start off by talking to you by showing you both toes, keeping their hands in plain sight, somewhere around their waist or their chest. It's kind of a bluff. You know, when people put their hands up, they're trained in law enforcement and that kind of thing, and they've got their hands up with their palms facing towards you. That's actually to allow them to have some standoff distance. That's a defensive, semi-aggressive posture that says, I'm standing up and I'm relatively ready to defend myself, but I'm trying not to make you feel intimidated. Now, if they do something like they shift that weak foot forward or the strong foot back, as soon as they do that, their hands normally go lower somewhere around their guard belt, their gun belt.
Right.
And why do they do that? Because that's where their weapons are. Most law enforcement today have a requirement that their taser, the non-lethal force, will be on the opposite side of the gun, the weapon, the sidearm, and that their sidearm is on their strong side, and that their taser is on the weak side, because there have been a lot of unintentional shootings due to confusion because the taser was located too close to the actual firearm. So that's a message. When that officer changes his posture and takes and puts his weapon on the far side from you to keep that weapon away from you should you try and attain it. Plus, it allows him to, normally his weak hand will come out in front of him and present a standoff, and allow him to either aggress or retreat as necessary to control the situation. In that, he will use vocal tones. He will use normally engaging, questioning, pleasant vocal tones up front, and then that tone will change and become more directed. So that whole thing, that whole escalation of force, once you have physical presence, all of those things run through those gambits in slow to rapid succession based on the ability to employ them in real time and maintain the safety of yourself and the others that are around you that are innocent. Going too fast?
No, you're good. I got you.
Okay. So there you go from there to generally non-lethal force. Non-lethal force used to be primarily baton, and it went to something like the ASP, the telescopic baton, and it went from there to the taser. Non-lethal force, if you ever, do take baton, take down, cuff and search, those things, there's this chart, and in this chart you'll have red, yellow, and green areas that give you liabilities to striking zones, to where when you're using a baton or something like an ASP, you can take what should be non-lethal force and move to deadly force if you move from the green areas of the body that you can strike without causing any significant serious bodily harm, to the areas like the sternum, around the heart, the throat, the head, the joints, any place where there's not significant padding in between the bones and the skin. Most of those areas are the red areas, and then yellow areas tend to be softer, fleshier parts, and then the large muscular areas tend to be green parts. Anyway, so you have this ability to escalate force through that before you get to deadly force, right? And that's striking someone in a very vulnerable area, or moving to, or using a taser, to moving to either a sidearm or shoulder fire weapon, something of that nature.
Right.
So those are the things that we go through in nonverbal communication, right? If an officer came up and did all of those things and never said a word to you, right? He shows up. He shows his physical presence. There's been a sign there that says, hey, please don't do this. He shows up. He walks up relatively calmly. You don't change your behavior. He shifts his posture to a defensive, aggressive stance. He shifts his hands near his waist, near his weapons. He puts his hand up in front of him and basically motions you to stop what you are doing. You don't stop, you continue. At some point there, some type of physical violence is going to occur, and if it were to occur, you should have absolutely no doubt as to why it occurred and the fact that it was going to occur.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and that's without ever saying a word. Right. So now I'll move into my should this thing exist? And if the things that all of these people say are true, and I have absolutely no reason to say that they're not, I have no proof of that, and I do a lot of statistical stuff, probability that this many people have formed a club and been in communication with each other to provide that consistent information is pretty phenomenal, especially when you start talking about the hundreds of years that this information has actually been recorded, right, before the internet. So if these things do exist, and if they are territorial, and they do have a way of marking their territory, and marking can be, well, let's take it to deer. Deer rub on trees, and they scrape the ground and urinate in it, right?
Right.
Male deer will rub the trees with their antlers, and they do that to strengthen themselves, show dominance, and to make others aware that, hey, I'm a male, I'm here, and you're going to have to deal with me if you try and become a male here, a dominant male here. So, and that's a deer. That's not a predator.
Right.
Other predators, cats, bears, they do all kinds of things, from markings on trees and laying down scent and all that other kind of stuff. They have just huge ranges that say, hey, this is me, I'm here, right? And I can do this, and if you can't do this, maybe you want to go be someplace else, right?
Right.
That's kind of the message of those things. Right? And again, this is shared communication from a 4-footed herbivore through a 4-footed omnivore carnivore. Same communication.
Mm-hmm.
Same basic methods. Well, if you take that and you transfer that into this thing and you say, okay, well, what do people say this thing does? Well, it'll reach up about 7 or 8 feet and it'll snap a tree, easily at 3 inches diameter at that height. I think that you found stuff like that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So basically, that is an expression of physical ability, no different than scraping a tree, sharpening your claws, making that type of mark, rubbing on a tree, that thing, right? Now, can you physically achieve that? Can you reach up that high in the tree, grab a hold of that, and break it off?
No.
At that height?
No, not at all.
No, right? So that's an expression. That's an expression of force, if this thing is real, that says, this is what I can do. You can't do that. Maybe you shouldn't be here unless you are ready to deal with me, right? Could be that message.
It
could be that it's broken over and it's pointed at water. It could be a buffer zone, standoff zone. It could be a message in between 2 clans that says, hey, this is where our stuff starts. We won't come over there. Don't come over here. There are all kinds of theories that fly around about that, right?
Right.
However, the common message for other things is, this is what I am physically capable of, and if you are not physically capable of this, then maybe you don't need to be here.
Right.
Right? So that could be a part of that message. So when you find that and you move into that area, you need to be physically, mentally capable of dealing with that thing. That's basically what you were saying to whatever left that message, whether it's Bigfoot or a bunch of kids, decide to go out there and do that thing, which I can't really support too much, given the remote nature of some of these things and the way they occur.
Right.
But, you're communicating to whatever left that message, that you acknowledge that message. If you take into consideration these things, you are now telling it, this is the communication that you're giving it. I acknowledge the message, and yes, I am mentally, physically prepared to deal with you. I know that you're here, right?
Right.
So from there, you move into what would be, or how you could interpret some type of activity or escalation of force from that thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
There could be the escalation of force and physical presence of being no different than your dad deciding to walk through the living room when you and your friends are showing you behind. He just wants you to be quiet, and he's kind of, just making his presence known as he walks through to say, hey, you're on the edge of being stupid. Please don't be stupid. So you could interpret the message of these things that, if they exist, that just kind of show up, treat you kind of like an unwanted house guest, impolitely ignore you and just move through. If they exist, if they're doing that thing, if they're aware of your presence, then you should, based upon other things, our behaviors, other primates' behaviors, other non-primate land mammal behaviors, that this is the basics of that message. You have to include that, in my opinion. Opinions are like appendages. You may be as interested in some of mine as I am in some of yours. Right? So all this stuff is opinion, and I really hope that I'm not boring your audience to death.
No, this is fascinating.
Looking at nonverbal communication as it's shared between us, as it's shared between non-human carnivores, non-human omnivores, non-human herbivores, right? You look at those common communication things and the way that they go through those things. And I'm a deer hunter. I've shot a lot of deer, and avid bow hunter. And you watch deer, and even deer will do these things to each other. They'll just walk through, and they will make their presence known. And if whatever's there decides, hey, I got you, brother. I'm going over here. I'm going to do my thing someplace else. Nothing else will happen unless that thing bolts and runs. Now, if it bolts and runs, it really doesn't matter if you're a herbivore, omnivore, carnivore. It will incite a prey instinct in that animal to where they will notice, and even herbivores will stop and take a few running steps towards something that's running off. Now, that may be interpreted as a sympathetic flight response. Why are you running? Do I need to run too? But my observation on a lot of that stuff is what you were doing, was it that bad? Do I need to chase you off? Are you running? Should I have chased you off? Mm-hmm. Right. So that's a part of that whole communication thing. And the communication that you say, once you see that physical barrier, and then you experience that sign, that nonverbal communication of something that's posted like "do not enter." Once you move past that, and you have that next experience of something just kind of walking by and kind of ignoring you, but letting you know that it's there, or stepping out and showing you both toes, but standing straight up in front of you, and basically saying, "Yep, I'm this big, and I can stand here and be vulnerable like this, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." Don't be more stupid than you've already been. Mm-hmm. And then step away. Right? It made its communication. How are you going to respond?
Right.
Now, you go from there at that point, and you've had that communication, or maybe somebody else has had that communication. You're not aware of it. This thing, should it exist, and it's had this thing, it's made its presence known, and people keep coming. Maybe it decided to expand its territory over a primary trail, something like the Appalachian Trail, or whatever the Pac West Trail is, or someplace in the national or state forest. And it's like, hey, these things aren't getting the message. Don't they know that I can, break them in half and turn them into Bigfoot poop if I really want to? Right? But as far as that thing is concerned, these things aren't getting the message. And I have made my presence known. I have showed them how big I am. I have given them the eye. I have looked directly at them. I've tried to ignore them. I've made my presence known. What would be the next thing that you would think would come? Non-lethal force. What would be the equivalent of a taser or a baton?
Probably a rock.
Throw a rock, throw a stick, that kind of thing. Somewhere in there, during that whole escalation of stuff between the physical presence and throwing the rock and the stick, you may get some tone of communication, some type of scream, some type of growl, some type of noise, maybe a rock clack or a tree knock, something like that. Something that's audible in between the physical presence communication and the low-level physical violence communication of throw a rock, throw a stick, combine that with a growl, a howl, something like that. So how do you respond to something like that? First thing is, don't show any animal like that your back. That's not the thing. Don't give its communication of staring straight at it. That is an expression of dominance. There are certain dogs, like I raise and I train dogs, and I raised and trained Rottweilers for a while. And a lot of people talk about being able to stare a dog down. I have handled numerous Rottweilers that you will not stare down. As a matter of fact, if you stare at them a little bit too long, they're going to come see you. And because of that, and the inability of being able to stare that dog down and intimidate it in that way, is why we moved to Rottweilers in some of the more hardcore prison systems. Because crowds and, staring that dog down and yelling at it and intimidating it, just, you get certain line breeds within that breed, it just doesn't work. Right? All it does is entice them further. But, when you compare physical ability, and if you take into account that we are roughly the same size as a chimpanzee, right? Chimpanzee at 250 to 300 pounds, under 6 feet tall, somewhere around 5.5 feet tall, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 times the physical strength of a Homo sapien of the same size, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you take that and you take the reports into consideration that says this thing may weigh up to 1,000 pounds, and if you say, okay, this chimpanzee at 250 pounds, let's say for easy math, is 5 times stronger than we are. Okay, 250 pounds to get to 1,000 pounds, that's times 4, right? But that's not going to be 20 times stronger than we are, right? That's going to move up exponentially. So you're probably talking something in the neighborhood of 20 to 30 times as strong as we are at 1,000 pounds,
mm-hmm.
if it exists.
Right.
Staring at something like this, trying to stare it down, I don't think that's a good message to send. I would really hope that that's something that big doesn't take you seriously when you stared at it like that. In its language, smiling. Smiling at something like that where one of its teeth, should it exist, is probably somewhere around 3 to 4 times the size of ours. To show it the equivalent of a mouthful of needles? No, that's not a good poker hand.
Right.
Right. Hey, here's my bet. I'm going to bet and I'm going to smile. Here's my bet.
Mm-hmm.
What if he decides to call?
Yeah.
Right. His hand is much higher than yours. So you move through this thing, and you've got this physical presence communication, and you've got this nonverbal communication, and you move into this thing of non-lethal force, of throwing things like that. What would be the next expression of force that you should expect? Should you be unaware of, miss the communication that occurs before that, or you weren't there for it because it just gave it to somebody else, and you just happen to be the unlucky one that shows up next? Well, that would be to close the ground, to put myself in a physical position from which I can exert all of this size and strength over you. I can bring that to full bear on you. And what do you call that?
Aggression?
You call that charge.
Charge? Yeah.
Yeah. Aggression. A charge, a bluff charge, that kind of thing. And the bluff charge occurs when you don't call the bluff. That's when a bluff charge is a bluff charge. Because if you call that bluff, if you move toward it, or if you stand there and you take an aggressive posture, right? Okay, I'm bracing myself. Come on in, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's probably not going to remain a bluff.
Right.
It's like, ooh, he called. I guess I need to raise. Now, if you're that person, when I go out in the woods, and the guys I go out in the woods with, we can call that bluff. I carry a weapon that'll stop 1,000 pounds. It's brutal. I don't want to. I promise you that if these things exist, shooting one of them is not on my list of things to do.
Right.
Because, the reports and the studies and all this other kind of things, these things live in social family groups, and I don't want to deal with all of the other family members. Because I shot Bubba. I don't want to deal with Jimmy Ray, Jim Bob, Bubba's mom, Bubba's dad, Bubba's ugly kids.
Mm-hmm.
Because these things, the primates, they're going to live under what Homo sapiens would call the feud. They have been wronged.
Mm-hmm.
And because they have been wronged, they can expect to continue to be wronged until what wronged them is no longer present or exists, right? So I say these things about nonverbal communication and how we use nonverbal communication all day, every day, right? Your significant other shows up, you can tell when something's wrong with them. You can tell when they're mad. You can tell when they're happy. You can tell when they don't feel good. You get in certain social situations, that one person that something is just not right.
Right.
You can watch people and catch the pre-attack cues, right? That somebody is about to attack someone. So he or she is looking to rob somebody. That person, I am not messing with that person. I'm going to step out of their way. And how do we know these things without ever speaking to them? By reading their eye contact, their body posture, their vocal tones, how they carry themselves, what message are they sending without ever saying a word. And that message is normally more loud and clear because it is a part of the animal of us and not the learned behavior, intellect part of us. But we have become so intellectual in some places, in my opinion, that intellect, which has made us so smart that we can build a car, has driven us to a place to where we can't step out of our home and feed ourselves. But these things out here with a tenth of the brain power that we have do that stuff every day, all day, are absolutely fine with it, and don't just feed themselves, they thrive.
Right.
And they are so much less intelligent than we are because we have become so intelligent that these things that got us to the point where we can experience the success that we have today, we have forgotten it all, that is not important anymore. But if you decide to step out there in that environment with those things that operate in that environment every day, and that's their home, you had better go back to some of that DNA, some of that primal stuff.
Right.
You had better be able to hear them, smell them, notice the smallest thing that's out of place, whether it's sight, sound, or smell. You better engage all of your senses. And you need to become proficient at it, and more proficient at it, the further you step off the pavement. And if you decide for the first time that you step off the pavement, that you're going to get a mile off of that road, a mile off of that trail, God bless you. I hope you took yourself an ELF transmitter.
So this concludes part 1 of my first podcast appearance on OK Chasing the Beast with Chuck Slabs. We look forward to getting the files to Chuck, but in order to do that, we've got to go to the website and record the actual show in real time. That's going to take a while because there are a lot of shows. If you want to see some of Chuck's shows now, head over to the Pennsylvania Bigfoot Project with Miss Mary. You can find some of his old shows there. Moving forward, we'll be adding all of the old shows from the OK Chasing the Beast channel, where Nate and I appeared as guests. We hope that you've enjoyed part 1, and we look forward to seeing you in part 2. As always, if you decide to step off the pavement, if you decide to step off the trail and get back into places where people normally don't go, you need to be mentally, physically, and emotionally prepared for what you may encounter. Take care. God bless. We love you. And until next time, have a great day.